top 4 division champions make it to championship weekend. This year feels as wide open as any professional ultimate playoffs we've ever seen.
It's on us to go keep winning.
We work harder than any team out there.
Every matchup's going to be uniquely challenging.
This is just a great crescendo to the season.
It's a battle at the buzzer, and you better believe Jeff Abbott lives for the moment.
And Madison Magic has returned to Breeze Stevens Field.
You can't script it any better way than that.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. We have reached divisional championship weekend here in the 2024 UFA season. 8 teams remain. 4 teams will advance to championship weekend, August 23rd and 24th in Salt Lake City, Utah. It really feels like a wide open field this season, with the New York Empire eliminated, the 2-time reigning champions, winners of 3 of the past 4 league titles, now gone from the playoff bracket. All 8 of these teams really figure to have a piece of a chance at claiming the 2024 league crown. Cameron, this is one of the most wide open tilts we've had in the entire league's history. We wanted to kind of give an overview of where these teams are at, where the road has led us to, and what to kind of expect from each of the 8 remaining competitors. And that will be Atlanta, Boston, Carolina, DC, Madison, Minnesota, Salt Lake, and Seattle as the remaining 8 teams vying for a 2024 championship.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of already said it about as well as you can. Like, it is so wide open. Even in years where we maybe didn't enter championship or, the divisional championships with undefeated teams, you kind of always felt like there was 1 or 2 teams that kind of were the cream of the crop. And those were the teams you kind of expected to be the biggest contenders for not just championship weekend, but winning the entire thing. And honestly, I've said this, I think I said this in our last episode. I think you could tell me any combination of the possible 4 teams that could be at championship weekend, and I wouldn't really be shocked by any of them. I think all of these teams have an incredibly good chance to win their division championship and give themselves ultimately a chance at taking the whole thing home.
6 of the 8 teams have never won a league title before. Carolina and Madison, the only 2 UFA franchises who have claimed a championship trophy. So there's just a lot of speculation at this point. And of those 6 teams that have never won a championship before, 4 of them have a losing playoff record. This is a completely different kind of bracket from what we're used to seeing the past several seasons, where we have this kind of anointed, almost demigod in the New York Empire and sort of the scatter plot of where everyone else arranges around them. And yet now it's just completely wide open as to who might be the hottest team. And yet, even within that sense, I don't feel like there is a clear-cut favorite. I do think, and we'll get into this as we kind of blitz through this episode, I do think Atlanta presents as the kind of favorite this season. They're at the top of my power rankings. I feel like how they've gotten quality wins and the performances that they've had have leaned into their, kind of de facto anointing of the number 1 in the league. But they still have 2 losses to a Carolina team that they'll be taking on in the South Division Championship game. They still have this kind of star-crossed playoff fate throughout their franchise's history. They're 1-3 in the playoffs. They've lost their last 2 playoff entries in dramatic fashion, in basically buzzer beaters, in 2021 against New York, in a buzzer beater at the end of the first overtime, and then last season hosting Austin in the South Division tilt. They lose in that. So, even the team that I think we kind of all prospectively pick as being the biggest beast in the remaining bracket, they still have a bunch of foibles. And I think from there, you can just kind of list any number of questions that you have for any number of these teams. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit, but there's just so much, I think, skepticism a little bit as far as what to expect from anything going forward.
Yeah, I mean, all of these teams too, like no one's entering undefeated. Everyone is entering this weekend with at least 2 losses, and which is like a whole nother thing that kind of blows my mind considering what we've seen in a lot of past seasons. But yeah, like I can very easily point to like here's the way this team loses the game. None of them are infallible by any means. I think they all have incredible strengths that they can lean on, and those are obviously probably where most of the differences are going to be made. Like whose strength is the true strongest strength in the game, right? Man, that was really an eloquent way to say that, wasn't it? How many times can I say strong and strength in the same sentence? But regardless, like they all have, performances you can point to, I think, that do raise some questions. Not even all of them losses. Some of the, lesser performances from these teams actually came in narrow wins against teams you feel like they should have put away, much earlier. Most recently, thinking of kind of like the Atlanta game against Dallas, where Atlanta kind of is cruising through the season, and then all of a sudden a Dallas team on the second day of a doubleheader nearly pulls off what would have been the biggest upset of the season. So I think I think that just adds to so much excitement though, because none of these matchups do I feel like there's like an overwhelmingly clear favorite. I definitely think I have teams that I think are a little bit more on the favored side, but I don't think you could say any of these matchups are even more, like at most more than like a 55-45 matchup. I really do think they're all that closer based off of what we've seen throughout the year.
I mean, to your point, all 4 of the host teams in divisional championship weekend have not won a UFA title. That's Atlanta, DC, Salt Lake, and Minnesota. Like these are 4 teams still vying for the top spot in this league, and yet they are the ostensible favorites in the second to last weekend of this entire season.
Yeah, and then you look at teams like, and a couple of those teams have never even made it to championship week. They haven't made a championship weekend ever, right? And they're hosting this. We have so many teams here with the chance to win a title for the first time. It's a really cool time to be a UFA fan. Like this is so much fun. It's one of the things that in sports that is kind of like the double-edged sword. Like when you have a team like the Empire that has this dynastic quality to them, it really does add a lot of intrigue, right? Like, because you always want to watch their games to see, are they going to continue the streak, or is somebody finally going to beat them? And when a team is close with them, it's like must-watch TV, right? Because you're like, is this the game? Philadelphia taking them to double overtime. We've had games where DC's taken them to overtime during that winning streak, and you always wonder, is this the game where it finally happens? And we have kind of a completely different feel, but I think that is also really exciting, where it's not that we don't have the dynasty to like root against or root for, but what we have is a bunch of like very good teams that you don't feel like at this point in the season, at least I don't feel like when we got to the final 8 teams, like that any of these teams don't belong here. Occasionally you get deeper into the playoffs and a team, I'll kind of even pick on my beloved Indiana Pacers, right? Like they got to the Eastern Conference Finals against the Celtics, and you kind of were just like, yeah, these two teams just aren't the same. And the Pacers made it a competitive games and all of that, but like you knew Boston was going to come out of that series, and they were just on a different level. I don't feel like we have that in any of these matchups, and I think that's why it's so exciting to me, because I think we just have so much quality ultimate that we're going to be able to watch, that there's not like a matchup where I'm like, oh, well, these two teams, who really cares, because they're not going to be difference makers once we make it to championship weekend. I think we saw last year where Minnesota was the team I think a lot of people were kind of doubting at championship weekend, and boy, did they go out and prove that they belonged on that field with Salt Lake. And if it wasn't for one of the most miraculous plays in our league's history, they would have found themselves in the championship game against New York. So we've seen in the past, like once you get to championship weekend, it's kind of all bets are off anyways. But I just think we have so much quality ultimate coming up this weekend that I don't have to just look forward to championship weekend. I know we're going to get 4 really good games coming up in just a few days.
So we've got 4 games upcoming this weekend, then 3 at championship weekend. We've got 7 total matchups remaining in the 2024 calendar. We'll definitely get into specific matchup previews for divisional championship weekend later on this week. But for this episode, I wanted to take our time to talk about how these teams got here, the kind of blueprint of what makes them great, and how they're still able to be in the playoff bracket this late in the season. And I think we're just going to go through alphabetically. So starting kind of conveniently at the top with the Atlanta Hustle. And I say conveniently because, as we kind of mentioned earlier in this episode, they are the ostensible favorites at this point in the season. I mean, they're first in the league in offensive efficiency. They're 5th in break scores per game. They're number 1 in red zone conversion rate. They're number 3 in HUT completion percentage. And that's all to say that they are the most balanced team in the league. On offense, they can beat you in small ball scenarios. They can strike deep. Brett Halsmeyer has been such a dynamic part of that attack, as kind of an unstoppable one-on-one big target. He is almost unguardable in deep space if you only have a single defender on him. Yet he has developed and kind of made his game so dynamic that he's kind of a little bit like a Jokic. Like, you don't really have an ability to cover him in a specific way. If you try to treat him like a traditional big, he'll beat you under, he'll beat you in small situations. He'll kind of work interstitial spaces, use his legs to out position his defender. And then if you kind of treat him as a little bit too cute or try to contain him in those spaces, that's when he'll stretch it long, beat you deep, beat you over the top, body out whatever defender is in his vicinity. And that just, I feel like, sets the tone for this entire team. And from that point, I feel like you can launch into any number of players on either lineup that have contributed this season on offense. I think especially in the latter half of the season, you got to talk about Austin Taylor as a thrower for this Hustle offense. He's been so dynamic, especially working alongside of Bobby Lay in their second full season together. You talk about Jeremy Langdon having the second best season of his illustrious career. He's one of the top 5 goal scorers remaining in the postseason at this point, averaging over 5.4 scores per game. Hayden Austin-Knabb having the best season of his professional career. Like, that entire offense, again, leads the league in success rate, is the most efficient unit, and there's a reason for it. They just have a host of players playing some really dynamic ball. Now you switch over to defense, and I think it's an almost even more interesting story because they've had some pretty notable absences throughout this season. You talk about Justin Burnett not having played a game since June 29th. You talk about kind of this shuffling of Lucas McClamrock, who has been ostensibly their best defensive performer throughout the 2024 season. And yet they just continue to be one of the most effective units, no matter what kind of style they play. I think at this point, much like Madison, they prefer a one-on-one matchup defense, but they have some of the most intricate zone coverages that they can throw out and deploy on teams to kind of gum up fast break attacks. And that's led by, players like Michael Fairley, Mike Kobira, Bradley Sunjins has been fantastic for this team. There's just, to wrap up my point, kind of contributors on either side of the ball that really make this team run. And so one of the things that I wanted to pose to you was not only as far as what does Atlanta need to get past as far as their demons in the playoffs, which I kind of alluded to earlier in the show, but what do they need to do, I think, as far as what they're doing well this season to continue this momentum? They lose 2 games early in the season to Carolina. They're 1-2 at a certain point, yet they've rallied off now 9 straight wins. They seem to be the hottest team in the league, and they're just performing in a way where they're in their stride. So again, doubling back, I know I'm going to always ramble. What do you think Atlanta needs to do to keep in this momentum, to keep in this place where they just, again, they seem like the favorite, they seem like the hottest team, they seem like they have everything going, and yet we've been here before. We've been with an Atlanta team that seems really good, and yet they just can't quite get over the hump.
I think a couple things, like I'll be waiting to see rosters. Obviously, this is kind of a blanket answer you get to every team. Like, are you healthy? Lucas McClamrock and Justin Burnett, missed multiple games at the end of the season. You mentioned both of them, I believe, as you were talking. And I think having those guys back obviously be huge. But I'm gonna kind of, and this may be not like the most stat backed answer you're gonna get, but I think that offensively they need to play with basically no emotion, and defensively that's where the emotion, kind of the hype, needs to come from. And I think when you go back to that Austin game last year that they lost, and one of the great games, like if you want to go watch just a game that's just full of emotion, full of intensity, and kind of comes down to the wire, that's one of the best games you can go watch. I saw an offense that tried to match the intensity and emotion that Austin brings to kind of every game they play in. And that's really just not what they do. That's not who Atlanta is. I feel like Atlanta, when they're at their best, when they score, sure, they kind of like might do a little celebration when they score, but there's not like all this screaming and really getting on the other team and addressing them. It's really more about them celebrating their own greatness and focusing on themselves. And I think that's what they need to continue to do. They can't let the moment or maybe any chippiness or intensity that enters the game affect the way that they are playing. And I felt like that was very clear to see even on the stream last year. I just kind of noted that they just seemed to be a little too chippy and focused a little bit too much on the wrong things. And then defensively, it's like the complete opposite. Like bring that emotion and bring that intensity. I think when they play with a lot of intentionally like directed emotion towards their play defensively, like you see Justin Burnett making a play and kind of chirping about it. You see, Mike Kobira laying out all over the field and letting his, when he gets the D or gets the score, letting people know about it. Like, I think they just kind of have to play to who they are as players and what their strengths are. And that is keeping it chill on offense and bringing the emotion and the intensity on defense. And you mentioned like Lucas McClamrock, like not a name probably a lot of people in the UFA would have like thought about entering this season. But I mean, this is a guy who I think you could make a very strong case for should be on an all UFA like D line, like one of first or second team or whatever. Like he has been a complete difference maker for them. And, Justin Burnett and Michael Fairley, dude, Michael Fairley gets more D's that I don't think he's going to get to than I think any guy in the league. Like when you see him move, he doesn't always look like the most fluid. And I think because he's so big, it doesn't always look like he's moving as fast as he is. Because he's just got like this kind of really wide frame, but he gets some of the most, like probably some of the most surprising Ds to me where I'm like, oh, that disc is getting completed. And then he's laying out of nowhere and grabbing a disc and, continuing to like take the attack the other direction. I think the other thing is they don't have to lean on Brett Holzmeyer. We have seen in their 2 wins over Carolina, Holzmeyer wasn't really the focus. He wasn't who was producing the most for this team. And I don't think they have to just lean on him in this Carolina matchup. They are so balanced and have so much explosiveness, but also ability to maintain possession on offense. My biggest question for them will be how noticeable is the absence of Matt Smith? They certainly have guys they can plug in there and have been plugging in there that are very capable, but do we notice kind of an absence of that release valve that Matt Smith can be, a guy who's going to get open, especially in small spaces, and who almost always is going to complete the next pass? Does that look like it's missing from this team, or do they just kind of trudge on business as usual?
So to answer or to respond to a few of your points, Lucas McClamrock, I completely agree. I think deserves at this point a mention on an all defense team. He's currently tied for 10th in takeaways in the league this year with 16. And just the kinds of blocks that he's gotten and the kinds of stuff that he's done in transition for this team, especially as a handler, really goes undersold in this league. I mentioned at the top of this segment, Atlanta is 5th in breaks per game in 2024. that is a huge part of what Lucas McClamrock has contributed to this team. And to your point, I don't think anybody really expected, as vaunted and as expected to be great as the Atlanta defense was coming into the season, for Lucas McClamrock to be this central of a point. And that's complete credit to him and his kind of elevation as a player. I think he deserves very much consideration for a most improved award or something of that caliber, in addition to an all defense nod. You also talk about Halsmeyer. I think absolutely that when they sort of put him in a little bit more of a throttled role and they allow him to be a little bit more of a system player, that is the stride that Atlanta wants to achieve. And yet at the same time, I do think in this particular matchup against the Flyers coming up in the divisional title game for the South, they'll need a few plays, maybe just 1 to 3 of Big Brett Hulksmeyer, just being unable to be covered in single space, right? Like, there isn't a player of his caliber, I feel like, remaining in the bracket other than Jeff Babbitt, who can just control an area of the field like he can. And I think that will be kind of a win condition for Atlanta in certain scenarios, particularly maybe at the end of quarters. And the other point that I wanted to bring up, you talk about kind of Atlanta playing without emotion. And I think that contributes to what they've been so successful at this season, which is limiting mistakes. I mean, they're currently tied for first in the league with DC for fewest turnovers per game. And I think that absolutely contributes to what you're talking about. Like, their ability to not just rely on the big play, which I feel like is where they were in 2021, kind of when they started this particular chapter of their franchise's development of having championship level talent, but not quite knowing the configurations or matchups that it will always succeed against. It felt like in that season, they were very much highlight driven. It felt like they were very much high octane, feeding off of the big play. Last year, it felt like they were adapting to that, but I think you make a very astute point about in that game against Austin in the playoffs, it felt like they got sped up and it felt like they got brought over into that kind of chaotic element that the Soul loved to play in, and that Atlanta, I think, spiritually vibes towards, but isn't necessarily where they're most successful at. And this season, it's felt like they've evolved a little bit past that, where in their win against New York in week 2, it felt like they had aspects of that. You think about the Justin Burnett plays, you think about Adam Miller kind of doing berserker mode after they would score break scores. There's this jubilation in it, but it was all very much packaged in a very systemic approach. Like, there wasn't this big play, just huck happy atmosphere that the ATL loves. It was a lot of very condensed drives and pretty disciplined scoring. And I just think that Atlanta has a terrific opportunity to kind of capitalize on that in the remaining games, because I don't really think that there's an opponent that can handle them at their best. And if they can hit that, I think it's their bracket to win at this point.
No, I agree. Yeah, when they're at their best, just because of how proficient they can be on both sides of the disc, it really does feel like there isn't going to be another team that's going to hang with them. And I think your point about Brett Halsmeyer is right. 1 to 3 plays is maybe what he really needs to like come out and be the guy. But it's really nice when you have a guy that can come out and be the guy on any given play, but also when he's surrounded with an offense that like there can be multiple points in a row where you almost like forget Brett Halsmeyer's on the field because they're just working it through everyone else and still scoring. But yeah, it just seems like in particular in these Carolina matchups, like he really hasn't had, their 2 wins were maybe 2 of his more forgettable games statistically. And he did exactly what you said. He had like 1 to 3 plays in both of those games where he, made a catch that no one else would have made, or where he made the throw that, he hasn't always been known for, but he's really, especially when he gets a good look at a nice big backhand. I mean, like, he really lays it out there for his teammates. Like, seems to be about a perfect throw every time. And if he can just play solid ultimate throughout the rest of the game and come out for those 1 to 3 plays, they're probably in good shape. And, you compared him to Jeff Babbitt, and those are probably the 2, in my mind, guys who are like it's kind of them and then everybody else behind them in terms of contention for the MVP award. And speaking of, Boston is next on our list.
I was going to transition into Boston. They are next up on our list of the 8 remaining contenders heading into divisional championship weekend. And I feel like they're kind of the it team right now, right? I mean, you mentioned Babbitt, that buzzer beater win basically against New York to advance out of the first round of the playoffs. They're just sort of meteoric rise within the entire 2024 season. I mean, again, it wasn't so many weeks ago that even the Babbitt signing was regarded widely as some kind of marketing April Fool's joke, that this was all like a big yuck, like, sure, he's going to go to the regional divisional rival that is the historic sports arch nemesis of New York. And that's exactly what has happened this season. He knocks off the 2-time reigning champions alongside of his teammates in the first round just over a week ago. And now they're setting up for a divisional championship matchup against DC. Both teams have never made it to championship weekend. And this Boston team, for as much as I think we want to doubt them for their lack of kind of playoff experience at this level, outside of Babbitt and Katz and some of the players that they've added, when you look at how this team is succeeding, they're one of the most impressive franchises in the entire fold and have been this entire season. And it's been why I think on this show, I've been a little bit bullish on them as far as what their ceiling is. You talk about what they're good at. They're first in the league in goals allowed per game. They have the 3rd lowest opponent red zone conversion rate, which means that they just make things hard in the easiest end of the field, which I think is a fantastic mental edge to have against opponents. And then just the kind of spiritual element of what we led into this segment talking about. They have the reigning MVP and somebody who looks like might become the 3rd 2-time back-to-back MVP winner in this league's history, joining Goose Helton and Bo Kittredge. We kind of posed this question and I think talked about in the last episode on the show. Is there a more valuable player in this league than Jeff Babbitt at this point, given what he's done for this team? I mean, to your point about Halsmeyer, he deserves all the credit in the world. And I think there's a handful of other players that deserve consideration. And yet, for how Boston has performed, for the particular strengths that they sort of undertake, it's been completely represented by what Jeff Babbitt does well, which is possession on offense and this takeaway heavy, pressure instituted defensive play that he even enacts on offense. I mean, at this point in the season, and I know it's including the playoffs, Jeff Babbitt is 2nd in the league, trailing only Lucas Ambrose in blocks. And again, that's representative of how this Boston team plays. They're just hard-nosed. It's hard to take it away from them. And they do really well in pressure cooker situations. They've won a lot of tight games against tough East Division competition.
Yeah, I mean, and that is kind of like, if you were going to knock them, it's like, well, they haven't played anyone outside of the East, so like, how do we compare them to everyone else? That being said, they're the last team that beat DC, who has looked in the most recent weeks leading into the playoffs like one of the best teams in the entire league. So yeah, they don't have that out of division experience, but they have, 2 wins over a New York team that, while they aren't the New York of old, certainly are a quality team, and a DC team who I think you could make a strong argument looks like the best or second best team in the league. To your point about Jeff Babbitt too, clearly there are other players contributing, but when you take the meteoric leap that you do in one season, like Boston has from last year to this year, there's a pretty clear line you can look at, the pre-Babbitt era and the post-Babbitt era, and it seems to align pretty well with that success, right? So, the whole team has definitely stepped up, and I think part of that is probably Babbitt's coming in, bringing a ton of experience, a ton of cachet. He clearly but it's he's also become a leader in that locker room, right? So he's not just bringing his physical talents over, he's bringing the leadership that he's developed as somebody who played for New York for a long time, even before they kind of got to the point where it seemed like they were always going to win the championship or at least be in contention, those 4 straight years making the final game and winning 3 of them, it's just, it is hard to be like, can you really even give Brett Holzmeier the MVP? Because like, as great as he's been, Jeff Babbitt's like turned an entire franchise from a middling, maybe might make the playoff team to a team that you could see competing for a title here in a couple of weeks. And that's no small feat. To your point about him also being second in the league in Ds, we've seen this happen a couple times before where a player playing mainly offense is like at or near the top in Ds. But I think the last time it happened was like 2017, which is, as we've talked about, kind of the pre-modern era of where we are in Ultimate. It hasn't really happened since then, but that's what happens when you have a, truly special and talented player like Babbitt is.
Well, and I kind of wanted to enter and just talk about how he's also raised all boats,
Yes.
He is this tide that just brings everyone up. I mean, you look at the development of Simon Carapella, who is an absolute closer and finisher for this Boston team around the goal line and as a goal scorer in his rookie season last year. But now he's added this fantastic throwing element. Ben Sadok, who's always been a producer in this league, he now has his collegiate favorite target on the roster in Jeff Babbitt, and it just completely shows in his confidence on the field. I mean, when Sadok gets into rhythm, he feels like a top 25 player in this league, and he's been able to get into that space so much more this season than he was in his first 2 seasons with the Glory. You talk about Peter Borth, who's been a fantastic prospect within the sport for the past couple of seasons. He's got 21 assists, 20 goals, while splitting his time between offense and defense. He actually has more time played on defense and yet has over 40 total scores, splitting it basically even as a thrower and a receiver. You can just go down the list. Orion Cable, 33 goals and 8 starts this season, and is added to just this physical dimension that Boston brings with Jeff Babbitt. Like we've talked about it off air, they have a size component that teams can't really deal with. And you could feel that against New York, where New York for years, because of Babbitt, because of Yacht, because of a variety of other players, has been able to out physical opponents. That's where Boston got leverage against them in the first round playoff matchup. And again, it goes to kind of what Babbitt brings. He's enabled Orion Cable to exist in his most optimal form in this league, which is just being a big who terrorizes you in space. And anytime you have a single defender on him, you fear for your defense's life. And it continues from there. It just feels like he's such an enabler of what this team wants to be. And I feel like we've been waiting for this expression of the Glory for, 2+ seasons now, where we've seen bits and pieces of it. We've seen, last year, their ability to go 7-5 and make it to the postseason. But this now kind of confidence, this bravado, it just feels so Babbitt.
Yeah, and I think maybe one of the coolest things, you don't always get to find this out in sports, but it's like when you take a guy who's an MVP, but is also clearly playing on the best team in the league, like, what do they look like when they're not surrounded by that same talent?
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't think this is something that was said out loud a lot, but I think there was definitely a question that was kind of like flirted with last year, which was like, yeah, Babbitt's the MVP. He's scoring all these goals, but like, he's not really doing anything in the throwing space. And like, could he really be a difference maker on a team that didn't feature Ryan Osgard, Jack Williams, Ben Yacht as, running mates? The answer is yes. And it's a resounding yes. Like if he goes anywhere in this league, if somehow he ended up anywhere else next year, I'd be like, yeah, that team might make it to championship weekend. I don't care who else is on the roster. Jeff Babbitt's on the roster. And, he clearly has, and we talked about this off air, I think of all the 8 teams that will be playing this weekend, Boston has the highest floor of any team. And what I mean by that is they're only going to play so poorly. Like, the worst that they can play is higher than I think any other team in this postseason. Where, if Atlanta's offense, for instance, really like struggles early and is like throwing turnovers, like they could have a stinker of a game, right? Like, but like Boston, with the way they play defense, they're always kind of going to be in it. They're always going to be relevant throughout the game. If there is one thing I worry about, if they get into a 2 or 3 goal deficit early, can they come back against especially against a DC team that's so good with the disc and has been so really kind of explosive offensively recently? We saw them come back against New York after being down 3, but New York's O-line played historically bad defense on a turnover this year, and that's not the same thing they're going to get from a DC Breeze team. So if there is one thing that gives me pause, okay, Boston, you got to come out early and put your stamp on this game and be in it. But if they are in it and they're within a goal or 2 at halftime, like, they've proven that they can find ways to like just grind a game out and like grind opposing offenses into like just feeling like they're playing in quicksand. And I think that's just such a strength. Like in any sport, when you can play defense, you're always going to give yourself a chance. And I think that's one thing Boston's going to reliably do in this DC game is the defense is going to be there. They're going to muck things up. So all the offense needs to do is just kind of do what they've been doing. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to always look super sexy, but they just need to continue to possess the disc and grind out these long possessions like they've done all year.
Yeah, I mean, Boston feels battle-tested despite not having much postseason experience. And again, that kind of comes from the dimension of what Babbitt brings. But I wanted to move along to the first South Division team we'll be talking about tonight, and that's the Carolina Flyers. They're, again, one of the 2 teams of the 8 remaining that have won a UFA title, and the most recent team among those back in 2021 against the New York Empire. The Flyers have a lot of holdovers from that championship team. You talk about Jacob Fairfax, Anders Jungs, Alan Laviolette, Ethan Bloodworth, Terrence Mitchell, on and on and on. This is a Flyers team with a very winning core. They have been the winningest franchise, I believe. I would have to go back and double check, but I believe they're the winningest franchise in this league since they joined in 2015. And yet it feels like they're a little under the radar at this point in the season. And I think that's due to Atlanta's impressiveness in the 2024 slate. And I think that's also due to the Flyers, double-digit loss to DC on the road just a few weeks ago, showing a kind of floor that I don't think that we necessarily expected from Carolina, as well as I think kind of the, pardon my language here, incestuousness of the South Division, where it's hard to get a sense of what those teams do outside of the division all the time. Again, to how this Flyers team performed against DC, it's impossible to kind of plot that against how Atlanta did against New York and Colorado, for example. It just feels like the South Division slate schedules so many of the teams so many times against each other that these results become a little bit self-feeding. And so I feel like Carolina has been kind of at the detriment of those results, because I still feel like this Flyers team is one of the most high ceiling potentials in the entire league at this point. They're second in total scoring. They're second in hucks per game. And their quality wins, I think, are something to note. They've got 5 wins against both Atlanta and Austin combined, which is the kind of performance I think we'd be a little bit more ravenous about in any other division. Kind of putting down that many wins against the other top teams that you would be competing for in playoff seeding positions. And just also getting into kind of the player granularity of, again, who they have on this roster. I mentioned their championship additions. Tobias Brooks right now is playing like one of the hottest players in the entire association. Like, this Flyers team just has a lot to like. They're I think 5th right now in breaks per game. Like, their defense has been incredible at times. Like, this Flyers team is performing on both sides. And yet, again, because of how Atlanta has performed, because of how I feel like we came off of last season with Carolina, there's just a little bit of drag with this Flyers team entering a divisional championship round where they have as much of a chance as anyone.
Yeah, I think the hardest part is like, how do you evaluate them? Because they played their best ultimate of the season in the first half.
Mm-hmm.
They have definitely cooled off. You know, they were number one in your power rankings, and deservedly so, midway through the season, before they went and lost to Atlanta for their first loss of the year. And, you know, the back half of their season, they haven't looked really impressive. Even in their first round playoff game, an Austin team that arrived late to the game due to travel issues was down. Evan Swiatek was down. They were down one other player. I'm blanking. But another one of their top players who I'm totally blanking right now. And my apologies.
Evans.
Yes, thank you. Down those two guys, arriving late to the field, Austin goes into the fourth quarter hanging tough. Now, to Carolina's credit, they absolutely put Austin down in that fourth quarter and showed that they are the better team.
I was going to say, like, I have a complication with a little bit of that narrative because Carolina had their clear fewest turnover performance of the season. And I think to your point about Austin arriving late, that definitely factors into it. But they had just 9 total turnovers. Their second lowest effort of the season was 12 for the Flyers. Their defense was still 9 of 12 on defensive break opportunities. It kind of felt like the soul punched up given all the circumstances rather than Carolina failing to put Austin down.
And you know what? Honestly, an analysis is probably colored by the way they played the last half of the season, right? It's like they weren't their best version of themselves in the last half. So I guess I probably am coloring their performance in that game more towards that negative side because we just kind of saw, like you said, we saw a floor that we didn't know existed for them in that DC game. They haven't been ultra competitive with Atlanta in the 2 games that have taken place in Atlanta. And I think one thing I really loved seeing in that Austin game, though, was Austin, whether you want to, Austin punching up and keeping that game competitive, maybe when you wouldn't think it would be given the circumstances, given who they were missing and the circumstances of their arrival. It kind of felt to me like the first time Carolina showed some like real resiliency this year, because that's kind of, I think, what's been a little bit to their detriment in their 3 regular season losses. It just looked like when things kind of started to go south, they couldn't recover from it. It just kind of got worse. And especially in that DC game, right? It's like it went bad early and then like they were just never able to find any sort of footing. It kind of looked like it just kept getting worse and worse. And their 2 Atlanta games that they lost, once Atlanta kind of jumped up and took a little bit of a lead and started to take control of that game, Carolina never was able to get it back. And I think it might be due a little bit in part to the way that they've been succeeding on offense this year. They are second in the league in hucks per game. And they are an incredibly good hucking team because, I mean, they have incredible, not only just throwers, but when you talk about the options of who they have to throw deep to, and Jacob Fairfax, Anders Ljungsten, Tobias Brooks playing just absolutely out of his mind over the last few weeks. Yeah, it makes sense. You want to put the disc deep to those playmakers. Like, who wouldn't want to throw deep to those guys? But I think what we see sometimes happen in the games where they start to fall behind is that they kind of start to look for those and then miss the openings that they have maybe in the middle of the field because they're looking, okay, we're down a few goals, like we need to strike fast. And there's definitely a time and place for needing to strike fast, but I think sometimes they lean on it a little too early in a game when there's still plenty of time to be made up. This Carolina team is insanely talented, and like you said, like they have the most playoff experience. They're definitely not done yet, but they have this great mixture of guys who have been around for a while with some youth that's kind of like coming up and becoming major players on their team. They've added some really, stalwart defenders over the last couple of seasons too, bringing in guys like Matt Tucker and Drew Swanson, adding Henry Fisher to the D-line. I mean, the length and speed on those 3 is just kind of incredible. Not to mention some of the great players they had there already. And it's just, if there's a team that can go into Atlanta and win, I mean, Carolina is definitely capable. And I think they just have to kind of shake off some of the demons of like their last three big, toughest games, two against Atlanta, one against DC. All three, by the way, were on the road. I don't know how much that plays into it, but it feels a little significant that three of their lesser performances have been on the road. But they're going to have to shake that off because, again, they're going to be on the road in Atlanta, and they can't. If Atlanta starts to take control at some point early in the game, Carolina needs to find it in them to like kind of stick to the plan that got them there and not kind of fold under that mounting pressure. And I do think that this is going to be the most competitive of the three games that will have taken place in Atlanta. I think Carolina will come off of that fourth quarter, especially they had against Austin, with a lot of confidence, as they should. And if we can see a similar performance to just the way they played and took care of the disc in Atlanta, it's going to be an absolute barn burner. We might see a game where both teams are like in the mid 20s.
I love your point about the resiliency of Carolina. I feel like that's a really important point to note about how this Flyers team performs this season. I think that they have some really quality wins, but to your point, it was in the first half of the season. And as we've seen with both the Flyers and Salt Lake, two of the last teams to have an undefeated record in the entire schedule, there's been this kind of fall off over the last month and a half that I do feel like both these franchises need to respond to. Like, I feel like there is some kind of question at this point in the season where they are two of the most winning franchises over the past couple of seasons, and yet there are sort of these skepticisms about what they do in big games. And I don't think that there's any question, to your point, about Carolina lacking any talent, but given the fact of how they performed against Atlanta and DC, there's just going to have to be another level that they elevate to, and a way in which they don't just kind of fall behind and then seemingly not be able to even it back up after a certain point.
Yeah. And, this is a team that's, got a lot of guys that went and won a championship and certainly capable of competing with anyone in this league. And I think that's something we've said most seasons about the Flyers. Last season maybe being the exception with kind of the weird roster that they were putting in week in, week out. But I mean, they showed that first half of the season how talented and how dominant they can be. And I think they just need, it's a little one of those things where you just kind of sometimes just got to remember who you are, like Mufasa once told Simba, remember who you are, and for so long they were the king of the South Division. And I think they just got to remember who they are and just, this is the division they kind of, like you said, probably I think the best record in the entire league since they entered. Sometimes you just got to remember, like, this is who we are. This is our division to win. I don't care if we're not the number one seed this year. Like, this is our division. We got to go in there and prove to Atlanta and prove to everyone else that, yeah, they're the new kids here, but this is our block.
Some fantastic individual performances from the Flyers this season. Laviolette, Fairfax, Brooks, Trevor Lynch for the D-line, and as a captain, I think has been one of the more underrated performers in this entire season. So yeah, they've got plenty of firepower in the powder keg, but we should move on. We should talk about, I feel like, the other big contenders still remaining in the bracket. The DC Breeze getting ready to host the Boston Glory in the East Division Championship game. The Breeze are currently number 1 in completion percentage as a team. They're number 2 in offensive efficiency. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, they are currently tied with Atlanta for fewest turnovers per game. Their defense has been on a run over the past month, just able to absolutely open up on opponents and pour in breaks. I feel like DC, aside Atlanta, really is kind of a favorite at this point, having their arch nemesis in New York already defeated from the bracket. It felt like that was kind of the matchup that could have been the sort of kryptonite to their possibility this season. And yet, kind of astride all of that is the fact that the Breeze have never made a championship weekend in their entire franchise's history. They're one of the winningest teams in the UFA's existence, and yet this DC team, much like Atlanta, has a lot to prove. They have all the talent in the world, and yet they just haven't quite won at this level. They've got Rowan McDonald, they've got Johnny Malks, they've got this offense that just seems able to kind of Rubik's Cube figure out whatever the defense is giving them, like whatever permutation, whatever coverage, they'll just sort of run a few passes and then figure out what they need to do against it. To your point, kind of a few minutes ago, they can just open up against teams. They're good in small ball, they're good in the fast break. They have athletes out in space. They can beat you and grind you out in the interstitial spaces. This DC team doesn't have a weakness, and yet there's this intangible aspect of what they need to overcome. What do you want to see from DC against Boston? And what do you think that their ultimate strength is? Do you think it's their ability to kind of activate on defense? Or do you think it's their passing depth, their ability to just overwhelm opponents with their options on offense?
Do I have to pick one?
Not necessarily,
really,
because I think that that's ultimately their balance and their strength.
Yeah, it's it's not quite to the dominant point that we saw with the Empire teams the last few years, but they do kind of feel like the team that's almost like playing better on both sides of the disc than anyone else in the league right now. Atlanta, throughout the course of the entire season, finished first in offensive efficiency, but DC was only 0.2% behind them. And I think over the last few games, DC has looked like the best team in the league. The completely dominant performance against Carolina and then another dominant performance in New York. It just feels like the stars are kind of aligning for them, where when we look throughout their schedule, they've lost 2 games by a combined 4 goals to a Salt Lake team that won the regular season in the West and a Boston team that, we already talked about how great they are defensively, and just like, having a guy who might be on the might be winning his second MVP in a row.
Both road games too. Both road games.
Yep.
Won the Salt Lake game, first game of the season, playing in a completely adverse atmosphere. New coach coming off of a historic old coach departure. Like the amount of other variables that the Breeze had to deal with going into Salt Lake in week 1. Ugh.
Down like 5 of their top defensive players from a year before.
Yup.
Yeah, I mean,
down their collegiate stars that they rely so hard on, and Jacques Nissen and a couple other their really integral pieces. I don't think Miles Grovic was on that matchup. I'd have to go back and look. Like, it was very much stacked against the Breeze, is all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and really outside of kind of a slow start, they really kind of held serve throughout the rest of the game.
Yep.
I mean, it did feel very much like Salt Lake was in control, but it also was like, yeah, Salt Lake's in control, but DC's also not really going away. And, here's what I want to see. I think early in the season, you and I were a little critical, I wouldn't say harsh, but a little critical of the way their offense looked. And we felt like in a few games early on, it almost looked like Rowan McDonald was kind of like the square peg in a round hole in the offense. Like sometimes it looked like they were almost forcing the disc through him, and then he maybe was like kind of trying to force the disc into places it didn't need to be forced. And it made the offense feel kind of like stop and go almost. And he seemed to always be the pivot point from where it felt like it went from stop to go and vice versa. And I have largely felt very wrong about that, like since about midway through the season. He's playing really well. I mean,
he's playing the best he's played in a couple seasons. He looks fantastic right now.
Highest completion percentage since 2021, second highest of his career. He, doesn't finish with eye-popping like plus-minus numbers, but, that's not who he needs to be in this offense. He just needs to be like everyone else in the offense, kind of just the guy who gets the disc and completes the next pass in rhythm and just keeps the offense flowing. And he's done that really well this year. And But here's one thing I am looking forward to. I don't know how much we've talked about this on air, but in the past, in the playoffs, Rowan has kind of been largely almost invisible in these playoff games, especially in the playoff games against New York, which were typically, win and go to championship weekend, lose and go home. And while this isn't against New York, it is a win or go home, like win, go to the championship weekend, or lose and go home. And I don't want to see Rowan be like Superman out there, but I just want to see him continue to succeed the way he has like this season. He's been playing so well. And this offense in recent weeks has kind of found the deep ball, like something that we wanted to see them do better. Now, don't get me wrong. They're not going to go out and be like Atlanta or Carolina or Seattle. Like, they're not going to do those types of hucking numbers and percentages. But they have found a way to generate some pressure on defenses with the deep game. And especially in recent weeks, their D-line is converting at an insane rate over their last few games. I think in their last 2 games, they have only missed a single break. Their defensive line conversion, they've only missed 1 break opportunity essentially that they've had in 2 games. And that is insane. Like, I can't stress how much pressure that takes off of the rest of the team, your offense, when your defense, like, a turnover happened. Well, we just know our D-line is just going to score. Like, imagine that luxury. And the thing is, it's not like they're only generating a few opportunities. They are getting, a dozen or more opportunities in every game from their D-line to score. And they're just converting every single time they touch it. And it feels like everything is coming together at the right time for them. Whereas in past seasons, it almost felt like they always went into the playoffs coming off of the back of like a New York game that they were kind of in, or maybe had an opportunity to take and just couldn't quite do it. And now they're coming in looking like superheroes. And it's such a different feel for this DC Breeze team. As great as Boston has been this year, and I do think they definitely have a chance in this game, DC to me is the heaviest favorite in this first round, just simply off the merits of how well they are playing it. Like, I don't even care who you match them up against at this point. They just kind of feel like a rock rolling downhill that has picked up so much speed at this time that I just don't know what stops it.
Couple of finishing points for DC. Among their top 10 scorers, the lowest completion percentage is Johnny Malks at 94.77%, which really speaks to the kind of efficiency that this team is operating with, especially through its primary playmakers. Among those 10 players, too, 1 is a defensive player, and unsurprisingly, it's Thomas Edmonds. He currently ranks 5th on the team in total scores. And I just wanted to speak to kind of a couple of their playmakers in Cole Jurek and Elliot Bonet. Jurek has been a member of this team now for 2 seasons, but he's been playing as a kind of almost MVP-esque candidate. I feel like in another season where there wasn't a Halsmeyer or a Jeff Babbitt playing his first season for Boston, we'd be talking a lot more about Cole Jurek. Elliot Bonet, similarly, he's just been such a need fit for this offense, having lost Ben Ort and Christian Boxley over the offseason. We talked about heading into this season, would it be a Thomas Edmonds? Would it be somebody else kind of elevating into a role on offense to kind of fill those production numbers? And I really feel like it's been Elliot Bonet, and he's kind of added bits and pieces of both Boxley and Ort's game where he's able to stretch the field vertically as well as play into this kind of dink and dunk, fast break, small ball offense that this DC team relies on so heavily, both at the professional level and in amateur divisions, where it just kind of runs downhill at you. Bonet has just slotted in and figured it out so quickly within his first few months within the entire country. Huge props to him. And then Tyler Monroe, man, I've shouted him out a few times on this show. Currently leads the team in total scores. He's just been an absolute kind of Travis Kelce. Man, I'm mixing up Kelce's. terrible night. Travis Kelce for this team, and by which I mean everything this DC offense excels at, he's a part of it. He kind of does similar things as far as Travis Kelce too, as far as this kind of receiving, blocking, throwing, do everything component for this Breeze offense, where it just feels like you get him the ball anywhere in the field, he's going to know exactly what to do with it. There isn't a double team. There isn't a situation that really flummoxes him. And I feel like that's so representative of what this DC team brings against opponents. But we've got to conclude there because we've still got another 4 teams to get to as far as blueprint analysis and kind of the DNA of what makes them great. I wanted to get to Madison. Madison is the most prove-it team alongside Seattle in the remaining playoff format, where they have a ton of talent. They clearly have a system that works for them, and yet, given their recent years of history, they've got to show up against this Minnesota team that has absolutely held the edge the past 4 seasons against the Radicals.
Yeah, I think, they really hit their stride after their second matchup against Minnesota. For those that don't remember, the Minnesota game was the epic Kai Marcus 11 throwaway game. And, since that game, they've really played just completely different offensively. Kai Marcus has really limited his throwaways. When he has thrown it away, for the most part, they seem to be like quote unquote good throwaways, where it's like you kind of want him to make that throw and it just didn't always work out, versus like forcing the disc downfield. The big question here for me is going to be like Pat Schreiwise. Like, can he play? Is he 100% for this? Because we saw in that Chicago playoff game just the clear difference from when Pat was on the field early and then what happened to the offense when he's not out there. I think there's just such a stark contrast. But man, I mean, this is a team that defensively just, I don't even know how they always do it. It's not like some teams where you can point to like a specific player. If there was one, I think I'd go with Sterling Kanaki. He's kind of the guy who seems like, hey, I need the disc back. Like, who can go get it? Like, he kind of feels like that guy. But they just generate enough pressure, enough like looks that kind of, a lot of times they like overload the side that the disc is on and just try to make anything easy. Anything that looks easy actually turns out to be really hard, because you're actually playing like 5 against 7 over on one side of the field. And then when they get the disc, they have been so good about converting. And what I've been so impressed with is that they've been able to convert really quickly with like deep strikes to Pierre and Robert, or maybe even Anthony Gutowski, since he, plays a lot of his points, he splits time. But they also have the ability, if that first look isn't there, to just kind of work the disc for 10 to 15 throws and also, come down with the score. Like Jake Carrico has been great on the counterattack in the handler space. He's also been, a blocks leader for them. And then Mitchell McCarthy, like, we didn't get to really shout him out in the last one, but he has been so integral to their counterattack as a thrower. And this is a guy who only played, I think, 1 game ever coming into the season. And he has become a focal point of their D-line counterattack. And it was completely unexpected. It's probably more so by all of us in the division who had never really seen or knew what this guy could do. But he's become a guy that you really have to watch out for. And, their break percentage was off the charts this year. And, early on, we kind of wondered, is that just because they kind of had all these games against a struggling Pittsburgh offense and these 3 games against Detroit? But they proved that they could do it against other teams as well. And I think that's going to be what they're going to have to rely on for success. They just have to be good enough on offense and then just ride that defense, which is really what got them here.
So to your points, 8 Radicals players have 10 or more blocks this season. They are number 1 in the league in takeaways per game at 13.5. And Mitchell McCarthy I've been waiting to bring him up on this show because he has been one of the most dynamic in transition defensive players in the entire association throughout the 2024 season. Among the top 20 players in Huck completion, he is the only player to have more defensive points played than offensive points played. And he's played like 90% of his points this season on defense. He's completing his deep throws at a 75% clip. He's got 18 Huck completions at a 75% rate. That is just insane kind of numbers to throttle at opponents and to just make them fear that kind of counterattack ability. And I can just tell you from watching them throughout this season that they absolutely run downhill at these opposing offenses when they get the opportunity to. And when Mitchell McCarthy has that backhand look, it's going up. And 9 times out of 10, it's going to Pierre and Robert streaking into space with a hapless offensive player trying to keep up with him. And it's just one of those things where it's not... It's a little like a 12-year-old figuring out the right plays in a Madden game where you just know how to beat opponents. That's kind of how the Radicals defense feels, where there's not a whole bunch as far as sexiness to what they do as far as coverages, but they'll trap you whenever they identify a poor thrower. Anytime you're on a sideline, they're going to complicate whatever you try and swing to in the middle of the field. They don't let you get easy unders, and they're going to play help defense over top. And then every single time they get a play, they're going to run out at you. They're going to try to initiate a fast break, and they're going to try to score running away. And it's diabolical at this point, man. Like, they've totally returned to the kind of throne of power that led them to 6 straight divisional titles back in the aughts.
Yeah, and it's really funny because they're obviously going to be in a matchup with Minnesota, whose D-line largely likes to play the same way, where they want to, like, get the turnover and then try to score in, like, 2 or 3 throws. And it's like, it kind of almost feels like in their matchup, it's going to come down to, like, who can do that better? Like, who can more quick strike from defense to offense? Pierre and Robert and Anthony Gutowski on the Madison side striking deep, and mostly Dylan DeClerc on the Minnesota side. And it's funny how, we talk about like metas that have like kind of evolved in different areas, in different divisions. And I don't know that this is division wide necessarily, but it's as far as the division championship goes, it feels a lot like hold on offense, play good defense, force a lot of turnovers, and then try to score very quickly on defense.
It's the Spider-Man meme, man. It's the two really Spider-Mans pointing at each other. I mean, these two franchises have blueprinted off of each other, and I think it's a terrific way to transition into Minnesota, which I think is kind of going through a bit of a mild identity crisis because, to your point, I feel like we traditionally associate counterattacking, quick strike defense with this Windshield team, and yet what they've been most successful at in 2024 is efficient offense. And I know you have a great point about kind of getting a little bit further into those numbers, but Minnesota wins with the best balanced attack in the Central Division. That's what's made them the 2-time regular season champions in the Central, is their ability to both pressure opponents on defense, as well as their offense's ability to, I think, hit a higher ceiling than any of their rivals within that division. You talk about, I also think their good mix. They've got this terrific kind of blend of young and old. You've got these upcoming playmakers in Will Brandt and Paul Krennick and Leo Sovel Fernandez and Gordon Larson. And then you've got these traditional vets and Dylan DeClerc, Brian Vanuka, Matt Rader, Josh Klain, Brandon Mattis, who kind of anchor everything. I feel like that has kind of been the preeminent success model over the last 2 seasons within this division. And yet, and I'm sure you're going to launch into this, there's a ceiling and a floor to this Windshield team that is a little disconcerting. There's a variance there that I feel like is almost greater than any of the 8 remaining teams.
Yeah. We saw the loss at home to like a Pittsburgh team that they completely dominated a few weeks before that. And Pittsburgh did start playing better later in the season, but this was not a game where like Pittsburgh was like playing really well, or this was just like a really kind of messy game on both sides. And they kind of have a Carolina feel to them where they played their best ultimate in the first half of the season and haven't looked as great in say the last like 3 or 4 weeks. But to your point, when things are working, they feel like they can compete with any team. And I think a lot of that is kind of on the shoulders of Will Brandt. Like when Will Brandt is playing at his best, they feel offensively almost impossible to stop because there just aren't a lot of players with his size and his repertoire of throws that exist in this league. And honestly, if there's a matchup where he's going to need to like really make an impact, it's in this Madison one, a Madison one where like the defense is going to like do some tricky things. They're going to overload sides of the field and really try to make you find creative throwing opportunities. And, Will Brandt can find a creative throwing opportunity as well as anyone in this league. And so I really think a lot of their playoff success, not only in this game, but should they win and move forward to championship weekend, is really going to be on his shoulders. You mentioned that this year it's really been the offense and their efficiency on that side of the disc that really seems to be carrying them through in their matchups. And I think we're going to have to continue to see that as the defense looks like it's lost a little bit of the bite that it's had in previous seasons. And it's one of those weird things where I don't have anything I can point to that seems to be the reason that that's happened. But there just does seem to be a little bit of a lack of pressure that they've been able to generate at times against some of the better teams that they've played against. We saw a Chicago offense that's really kind of been up and down and struggled a lot of the year go in there and look completely dominant and look like they could not be stopped. And that's really strange going into like up into Minnesota, where Minnesota has been so good at home, especially defensively. But like you said, like they're kind of blending some of this new young talent with some of their veteran playmakers. And, Gordon Larson has been just fantastic. Leo Silva Fernandez has been great. And then you have these guys like Bevon and DeClerc, who you can kind of always count on to just like bring playmaking in big game. Like it seems like they show up in big games pretty regularly. Like Bevon was absolutely a star in their game against Salt Lake City last year. And then you have a guy like Matt Rader that's been added to this offense. And I think outside of Will Brandt, Matt Rader might be the next guy I look at to see like really put his stamp on this game. Like if he can show up and make 2 or 3 just big plays throughout the course of this game, I think that spells a lot of success for this Minnesota team. Because I think when you look at some of their better performances in the season, he has been a big part of that. He's made like memorable plays. I think back to their first game in Chicago where he runs down the field almost next to Josh Klain as he releases the huck and goes up over a pile of like 6 guys to pull down a disc. I think of him running away from a Colorado defender coming out of a timeout, which really kind of felt like it was the play where it kind of cemented that Minnesota was going to win that game. I think of the game in Madison where there was a rain delay and he kind of comes in after arriving late and just immediately puts his stamp on the game with a sliding catch and then into a goal for a goal and had scored another goal like right before that.
And yet those were all plays kind of in the first half of the season. You talk a little bit about at the beginning of the segment, the Wind Chill's best performances kind of came before the 4th of July. And so now we're faced with this Wind Chill team that doesn't really have its defensive identity. They've really struggled to get breaks in any game that's not against the Mechanix over the last half of the season. And to that point of what's missing from that, it feels like just consistency as far as starters. I mean, they don't have a defensive player this season aside from Cameron Lacey, who started in every game for the Wind Chill in 2024. And there's such a team defense strategic alignment that when they're missing players for a game or two, it really starts to add up for them, because you think about what they were most successful for over the past couple of seasons. It was having help defense in deep spaces. It was being able to crowd lanes. It was being able to exchange different kind of assignments in tweener areas of the field. Like, those were the sort of disciplined areas that the wind chill really put themselves a level above opponents. And right now, they still have that talent, but Dylan DeClercq has started in 8 games. Brett Bergmeyer, due to injury, 9. Like Paul Krennic, 7. Like even Brandon Mattis, somebody who's almost been a kind of Iron Man award winner over the past several seasons for this franchise, missed a game. Like, there's a little bit of discontinuity right now for this defense that has otherwise been the class of the division over the past few seasons.
Yeah, we'll see what kind of lineup they put out there. I would assume they're going to have, Sam Berglund is back. I think that is a big get for him. He's been out almost the entire season. He hasn't played since like week 4, somewhere around that time. Or I think he did play in their final regular season game, but prior to that had not played since about week 4. If they can get, Sam Berglund and Brett Bergmeyer both back, like that's 2 humongous gets for them. But to your point, there hasn't been a lot of time for them on the field as an entire defense. So even if they get all these guys back, are we going to see the same defensive performance we've seen in past seasons when they really haven't had as much time on the field together this year? As much as you'd like to say, sure, they have all these reps from previous seasons and maybe practices that they can rely on, there is a difference between all of that and then like continuing to build that continuity during the season that you're currently in. So they're much like Carolina. It's like, can the Minnesota team we saw in the first half of the season suddenly reappear when they need it most? Because they're going to need that team to knock off a Madison team that has, in the last part of the regular season, played their best ultimate. And then while it was a very messy game in their first round playoff matchup, found a way to grit out a win in a game where things just weren't even going right for them. It kind of feels like they're a team of destiny almost, with how the game against Chicago went, where Minnesota kind of feels like things are just kind of falling in the opposite direction.
Well, to close out this episode, let's get into the West Division tilt. And first, starting off with the reigning West Division champions from Salt Lake, the Shred. They get set to host Seattle in the West Division championship game. And the Shred, kind of as a theme of a few of the teams in this episode, really exceeded in the first part of the season and then have slowed down in the back half. And that's been due, I think, primarily to injuries. They lose Joe Merrill to a season-ending injury. They lose Kyle Weinberg to an ongoing injury right now. We'll see if he gets activated for this divisional championship game. Jordan Kerr has been battling a broken, non-throwing hand. Will Selfridge missed almost 2 months of the season. This Salt Lake team has been not so quietly undergoing a lot of trepidations and just struggles with consistency in their lineups. And yet, they still come out first place in a very contentious West Division. They're 5th in red zone conversion rate despite some of their struggles to begin their season and their evolving lineups. And they just feel like a team that I think we really undersell what they've been able to do in the games that really matter for them. We talk about their win earlier in this episode against DC. While that wasn't the most optimal Breeze lineup, Salt Lake still gets a win against what appears to be a top 3 team in this league in 2024. They put down Colorado in the more important matchup this season. They defeat Seattle in the final weekend of the regular season to clinch the number 1 seed and host this divisional title bout. Like, every single time I think we have a question for where this Shred team is, they have an answer for it. And while they're not necessarily in the same sort of state that we were used to seeing them in coming off of their 2023 season, where it just felt like if they weren't able to be this efficient juggernaut of offensive performance, they were able to grit out playmaking, clutch sort of games as they did in the semifinals against Minnesota. This year has been a marked shift from that, and yet, they're still here. There's still a team with one of the most impressive resumes remaining in the bracket, and I still feel like they're a team that's as formidable as any remaining franchise in 2024.
Yeah, we've kind of been waiting on them to find some of that like offensive magic that they've had like early in the season, that they had last year. And it just seems like you're right. The injuries have really kind of derailed that, with the hand injury to Jordan Kerr, with Will Selfridge missing a lot of games. And, there seem to be, like you said, it's kind of interesting that we have a number of teams in the playoffs who seem to have played their best ultimate in the first half of the season. And then they've been kind of hanging on. If there's something that gives me some confidence in Salt Lake, it is the fact that while they were kind of in the back half of their season and slumping to some extent based off of where they were before, they were able to take a Seattle team who came in, who was hot, who'd been playing really well, and first quarter kind of just came out and punched them in the face a little bit. Second quarter came out, increased the lead, and kind of showed why they were, the favorite in the West coming into the season. Now, in the back half of that game, Seattle did outscore them and did seem to maybe find some footing. So is that more Salt Lake having a lead and kind of just getting a little comfortable in the game? Or is that Seattle kind of showing that, like, coming into this game, they're ready to punch up to a Salt Lake team that coming into the year, especially after the news of the Empire departures, kind of felt like one, if not the absolute favorite, one of the top 2 or 3 teams that we were considering to be the favorite? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to expect in this game. I'm excited to see a rematch of this game, though. I think these are 2 of the most fun teams in the league to watch, and the fact that they're on the field together just kind of adds to that. Salt Lake, despite some of their struggles, still finished very high in most offensive rankings, and they're still really good in the red zone, which I think has been a stat that has been kind of telling for most of the season. The teams that are performing really well in the end zone and get there with regularity tend to do really well. And, they do have 9 games with 12 or more goals inside the red zone. So they're getting there a lot, and they're being very successful when they're there. I think that's really what they need to focus on. Like, sometimes they can get a little too loose, especially if they get a lead early, and it has allowed some teams to kind of get back into games that maybe they shouldn't have been in. And in the case of like their home Colorado game, it actually allowed Colorado to come back and completely steal that game away that seemed like it was unwinnable for them almost at times. But their bread and butter is getting it down to the red zone and converting. They don't need to strike deep. Striking deep for them is a luxury. It's something they can do when it's there, but when they're forcing it, they're not at their best. When they let it kind of just naturally occur, they feel kind of unstoppable.
You know who they're kind of similar to? Madison, in ways, because I feel like their best deep strike ability is in transition. They're one of the best defensive break teams in the league. They're currently 3rd in breaks per game at just over 8 per game. And especially with their kind of, I don't want to quite call it a fall off, but there's certainly a visible depreciation in their offensive play this year. They ranked 2nd in offensive efficiency last year. Or were they actually 1st? Hold on one second. They were 1st in offensive efficiency in 2023. Yeah. This year, going into the divisional championship round, they're 11th. And so they're still a top team, but there is certainly a lot more question marks around how their offense is playing. And I just reflect back on what their head coach said last year about how the Shred were playing in 2023, which was that it felt like everyone improved 10 to 15%. And it's felt like that improvement curve has flattened out a bit. And that's really no fault of anybody. I feel like that's a very natural progression for any kind of sports franchise. And yet, what that's meant is that the absolutely accelerated youth curve of the West Division has been able to catch up. It's allowed a Seattle to just like summit, excuse the pun, up to a level of the Shred. And that's I feel like where the Shred are at, is kind of managing expectations. Last year felt like such a hockey curve exponential rate of growth that this year it feels more in line with the natural way of things, of just, hey, you're going to hit a couple of snags and have to deal with it. And I think it's really interesting to see how the Shred are going to be approaching this upcoming matchup against the Seattle team, who has sort of been on the inverse of that, where they're exceeding every expectation. This was kind of not where they were supposed to be in 2024.
Yeah. One thing that's really kind of interesting too, when you go, like, you kind of think about their offensive struggles, 4 players on their team who play a significant amount of O points are completing their passes at 2 to 4% worse than they were last year. You've got Jordan Kerr, who's improved in that area, and you've got Jacob Miller and Luke Jorgensen, who largely are kind of around the same place they were last year, which is phenomenal numbers. I mean, Jacob Miller is like 98.5% completion percentage for a guy who touches the disc as much as he does, is like phenomenal. It's otherworldly. But then it's really a lot of the downfield pieces. It's Jay Stunabile, it's Grant Lindsley, it's these other guys who are still touching the disc quite a few times. And these Elijah Jaime fits into this category. I mean, they're completing.
Ben Field, the rookie, who's been fantastic as a playmaker, but is completing under 91% of his throws.
Yeah. So you take a team that, like, one of the things that made them so good last year, it was just like every person on the team was able to get the disc and move it quickly to the next person. Well, now you're taking some of these pieces like a Jay Stunabile and a Grant Lindsley and an Elijah Jaime, who last year were doing that I think all were doing it at rates of like 94.5 or 95% or higher. And this year, they've all dropped like 2 to 4 percentage points in that area. And while 2 to 4 percentage points doesn't sound like a ton, when you do that across like 3 or 4 players, we're talking about, throughout the course of a season, an extra dozen or so turnovers. Like that adds up pretty quickly. And we're talking about the offense just being a little less sure, a little less steady. And there have definitely been some like outlier games in there that have contributed to this. Like, Grant Lindsley had a 5 turnover game against New York, and that's like very much an outlier for him, right? Like, that's not something he's doing with any sort of consistency. The thing is, they just didn't have games like that last year where that was happening, where one guy was throwing the disc away a lot. They didn't have the overall just like increase in turnovers, right? So you add in that these players are all throwing a few more turnovers throughout the course of the season, and it makes sense, especially knowing that a lot of that struggle was kind of like in this middle to late part of the season. That's where a lot of those turnovers were taking place. And it makes sense that they were kind of struggling heading into the playoffs. That being said, we've seen this team, even this year, how dangerous they can be offensively when their pieces are there and when they're able to connect from player to player to player. And I think a lot of that just is kind of on the shoulders of Will Selfridge. Like, there has been a clear line of demarcation for what they have looked like on offense when he's been there and when he's been absent.
When Salt Lake's offense can attack, they are absolutely a championship contender in this league, and it's just been a few weeks since we've seen that kind of level. To your point about how they played against Seattle, 9 of 21, on offensive possessions against the Cascades. And I feel like that transitions well into our final team here on this episode, the upstart kind of Cinderella Seattle Cascades. This is a team that had the longest absence from the postseason of any team to make the playoffs this season. They hadn't made it since 2016. And yet here they are in the divisional championship round, having won against Oakland in the first round of the playoffs at home. They enter into this game first in scores per game in the UFA, tied for first in breaks per game with the Madison Radicals, second behind Madison in break rate, meaning that they disturb opposing offenses second most of any team in the association in 2024. And Seattle is also in first place in Huck completion rate at over 72% in 2024, which means that Seattle just kind of stretches the field in every direction. They're the most explosive team of the remaining bracket. And the Cascades just bring, I think, a certain volatility that any opponent should be afraid of. They absolutely have the star power to sort of punch with any remaining team in the entire association. But their real hamstringing element is the fact that they had the least experience of any playoff team in the current fold.
Yeah, but that doesn't worry me. Honestly, does not worry me. I think there were some teams where that would worry me. Like, I'm almost more worried about that with Madison, despite the fact that they have some guys with experience, because they also have so many guys who have never played in a playoff game before last week or a couple weeks ago. And with the Seattle team, it doesn't really seem to bother me, and I think it's because everything's felt pretty new for them this year. Like, the success they have had this year is completely unknown to these players, at least at the UFA level. But it hasn't really seemed to matter. Like, when they've gotten to a challenge, they've been able to rise up to it, and if they didn't straight up win the game, they were able to be competitive in it. Like, I think about their doubleheader road trip near the beginning of the season, where they go into Colorado on the back day of a doubleheader, back when we really didn't know what we were going to get from the Seattle team, and they just hung tough. And despite the fact that they did ultimately lose due to a slow start when they went to Salt Lake, they outscored Salt Lake in the second half. They were the better team in the second half of that game. They have the number one playmaker on defense in the entire league over the last 2 seasons in Lucas Ambrose. They have Khalif El Salam, who kind of feels like he can just do whatever you need him to do on the field. He can strike deep. He can be the guy running kind of like the give and go and running the offense through him in the handler space. He can go get you a D in the handler space. He can go get you a D downfield. They have, and when you really think about it, if it comes down to a universe point, they might have one of the scariest UP lines that you could put out on the field when you think about putting guys like Garrett Martin and Zeppelin Raunig and Jack Brown and Khalif El Salam and Aaron Wolf, and I can go on and on and on with who they could put out there in a do or die point. They check all the boxes for the things they can do. I think as long as they don't get off to a slow start like they did their last trip to Salt Lake, we're going to see a Seattle team that is absolutely in this all the way till the end of the game with a chance to win. They just have so much playmaking and so many players, and we've gone through the list multiple times now with how shocking it's been to us, but how incredible it's been that they have so much talent and so many contributions from guy 1 to guy 20. And so many guys generating Ds. It feels like if there is a team that can really go from kind of the doldrums where they've been for the last few seasons and suddenly make this meteoric rise to championship weekend, I think this is the team. They have all of the ability and they have all the different pieces you would want in a championship level team. It's just that experience that they're missing, but I think they've kind of been gaining that experience as the season's gone on.
So to that point, Seattle has had 9 straight games with under 20 turnovers, which has always kind of been my Mendoza line for performance. I feel like 20 is kind of the magical number that you need to exist under to kind of be in any sort of game, let alone be an elite team. And then the other number that I really want to reflect on going into this Salt Lake matchup is that in their Week 13 matchup against the Shred, in a similar environment going into Zions Bank Stadium, Seattle attempted just 2 hucks, completed 1 of them. Again, this is a team that led the league in huck completion rate, is one of the best deep strike teams in the entire association, and yet just did not have an ability to engage that third level of the field against the reigning division champions out west. And so they have to, I think, come with a more aggressive attitude and a little bit more of a confidence in what they can do, because I feel like other than how they closed out that game, that was what was so non-existent for the Cascades team in the first half in their last matchup and only matchup this season against Salt Lake.
Yeah. And I think they really just can't let the moment get too big for them. They gotta be who they are, right? Like
It's weird. They have dudes, to your point about Khalif and Christian Foster and Garrett Martin and these players who have had big game experience, Tommy Lee, and yet it hasn't coalesced into this environment. And I feel like they need to still establish themselves at this level.
Yeah. And it feels like they feel like a team where, like, the second chance they get, they don't miss, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
We saw them miss in Colorado. They got a second chance against them, and they took advantage, right? And I largely feel like we're going to see the same adjustment here, where they're going to look at what they did their first meeting in Salt Lake. They're going to make some adjustments, maybe return to a little bit of who that they've been all season, right? Like, they're not the team that throws the most hucks per game, but they certainly huck it more than twice a game, and they do it with a lot of success. So, like, they don't need to go crazy, right, and throw 15 hucks in this game. But I think if there's somewhere around 9 to 10 hucks in this game from them, that's kind of more where we're going to look them, where they're going to look like themselves. They're going to look like the team that got here, and they don't want to force it, but at the same time, they have the playmakers downfield. If you see a one-on-one matchup going deep, and the Salt Lake Shred defense is one of the more athletic defenses in the league, but I think when you're talking about going, there's a point offensively where you kind of have to be like, I know that the defender's close, but I see one-on-one coverage. There's no way there's help defense, and our guys have been pulling them down all year, and we need to just continue to know that our guys can do that. We can't kind of shrink in the moment and kind of get too safe, because that's not what got them here. Like while they've certainly played efficient ultimate at times, playing safe has not been part of the equation for them. And they need to play with that confidence and that swagger that takes advantage of those deep matchups when they get them, and doesn't just rely too heavily on like this dink and dunk stuff, which kind of felt like what they were doing a lot of the Salt Lake game.
You mentioned that Seattle doesn't miss on second opportunities. I wanted to extend that to you're not going to want to miss this divisional championship round upcoming on August 9th and August 10th. Available live on watchufa.tv. But that'll do it for this episode of Swing Pass. We will be back this week to preview all 4 games of the divisional championship round. That'll be the Central, East, South, and West division matchups. We'll be coming back at you to get more in depth about what each team can succeed at and which questions we have entering into the penultimate weekend of the entire 2024 UFA season. That'll do it for Cam and I right now, but we will be back with you soon. Bye for now.
Oh, he's getting the crowd going.
Are you kidding me? You are kidding me! Holy smokes!
Was there any doubt? Was there any doubt?
This is going to be the game. Joe Clutton battling for position. He tips it to the end zone where it's caught by Elijah Jaime at the buzzer to tie the game. Incredible awareness from Clutton